I was denied entry to the ship until the nurse revealed I had saved her during the war. It was meant to be nothing more than a quiet gesture, a personal goodbye to a part of my life I had long kept buried beneath decades of silence, grief, and forgotten medals. In the spring of 1989, on a windy afternoon in Seattle, a towering Soviet hospital ship docked at the port as part of a Red Cross humanitarian mission. And although I had no real reason to be there, no formal invitation or military badge left to show, something within me, perhaps an instinct, perhaps guilt disguised as curiosity, compelled me to go, to walk those familiar wooden piers once more, not as a soldier, not even as a veteran, but simply as a man chasing the faint echo of who he once was. I didn't expect anything, didn't hope for recognition or redemption. I only wanted to see the vessel, feel the salt in the air, hear the deep groan of the ship's hull pressing against the dock as if it too carried memories that refused to rest. I told myself I would stand at a distance, hands folded behind my back, like so many other old men watching a world that no longer speaks their language. And yet, as I approached the gangway, the sight of nurses in white uniforms, the Red Cross insignia gleaming in the fading daylight, triggered something in me so strong that I kept walking, almost unaware that my legs were moving forward, closer and closer, as if drawn by a gravity I couldn't resist. That's when the young man in uniform, polite but firm, stepped in front of me and said, "Sorry, sir, this area is restricted. Only Red Cross and authorized personnel may board." And though his words were kind enough, they struck me like a door slamming shut, not just on the ship, but on the years I had lived without closure, without answers, without ever knowing if anything I had done in the war truly mattered in the end. So I nodded, turned halfway around, prepared to slip back into the shadows, to return to my life of grocery store aisles and bus stops and long, quiet evenings staring at photographs no one else remembered. And then I heard her voice, calm, steady, but charged with a weight I recognized instantly. And when I turned, I saw her. A nurse, perhaps in her 60s or 70s, in full uniform, white hair pulled tightly back, eyes locked onto mine as if no time had passed at all. She pushed gently through the group, raised her hand toward the guard and said, "He comes with me." And when the guard hesitated, confused, she added louder now, This man saved my life during the war." And the moment held us all, suspended, breathless, and in that split second, the decades peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing a piece of my life I thought had vanished forever. If this story touched something in you the way it stirred something in me, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing real stories that inspire, heal, and stay with you long after they're told. And now, hold on, because what comes next will change everything. The moment she said those words, that I had saved her during the war, everything around me began to fade. The cold steel of the gangplank, the hum of conversation on deck, the distant cry of seagulls above the Seattle harbor, all of it blurred, swallowed by the sudden, overwhelming force of a memory I had spent a lifetime trying to contain. A moment that lived just beneath the surface of my aging skin and rattled bones, waiting for the right voice to awaken it. And just like that, I was no longer standing on a ship in 1989, but back in April of 1945, deep in the heart of a Europe torn apart, where fire, chaos, and death were not the exception. They were the atmosphere. We were stationed near Stettin, now Szczecin, Poland, though back then it was still caught between falling empires and desperate final offensives, and my unit had been assigned to support the evacuation of a mobile medical convoy under constant threat from artillery and air raids. Everything smelled of mud and smoke and rotting supplies, and the ground, thawing from the cruel winter, sucked at our boots with every step like it wanted to pull us under. Morale was a ghost, sleep a luxury, and food something you only spoke of when it was too dark to hope. That morning, the sun was low and hidden behind a veil of grey that made it impossible to tell the time. But the silence broke in a heartbeat when the first bombs fell. Sudden, sharp, indifferent to the red cross painted on every truck and tent. And before we could dive for cover, the entire camp exploded into shrieking chaos, metal splinters, screams, the unmistakable whoosh of a canvas tent catching fire like dry leaves in summer. And in the middle of it all, through the black smoke and the spinning panic, I heard something I couldn't ignore. A voice, faint, muffled by flames and dirt and terror. A woman's voice, not screaming, not even calling for help, but something more haunting. The sound of someone trying not to be forgotten. I don't remember deciding to run. I just moved, drawn by something primal, something human, maybe guilt, maybe defiance, and I tore across the camp toward the medical tent that was now fully engulfed in flames, even as other men shouted for me to stop, even as the air grew thick and unbearable. I ducked inside through a split in the canvas, and I still remember the heat. It wasn't just hot, it was alive. It clawed at your lungs, scraped your eyes, and wrapped itself around your thoughts like a nightmare that wouldn't let go. She was trapped beneath part of a collapsed surgical frame, one leg pinned awkwardly beneath a steel table that had melted at the corners. She wasn't struggling, just looking at me with eyes wide as the sky, eyes filled not with fear, but with surrender. And that look, that awful, beautiful look, broke something open in me. I don't know where I found the strength or how I lifted that damn table, but somehow I did. Dragged her out by the shoulders, wrapped a burned towel over her mouth to keep the smoke at bay, and stumbled backward just in time for the roof of the tent to collapse where she'd been. And when we fell to the ground outside, coughing and blind, she clung to me like she didn't trust the world to still. "Be there," she said one word, "thank you." Not through tears, not with drama, just softly, with a clarity I've never heard since. Then she was pulled away by the medics, bundled into a transport truck, driven east with the rest of the evacuees, swallowed up by the war just as quickly as she had appeared in my life. I never learned her name. I never knew where she went. For decades, I convinced myself it was a dream, that maybe I had imagined her to justify the weight I still carried. Because when you survive something like that, when you live through fire and blood and loss, your memories can turn on you. Your mind starts painting faces over the silence just to give the pain somewhere to go. But now, here she was, after 44 years, standing before me with the same eyes, with a voice steady and real, giving shape and truth to the memory I had never dared to trust completely. And in that moment, as the wind passed gently over the deck, as the ship groaned quietly behind us, I knew something I had never allowed myself to believe. I wasn't imagining it. She had survived. She remembered me, and what she was about to tell me would change everything. After the war ended, I came home not to cheers or banners, not to parades or brass bands echoing through small-town streets, but to a kind of silence that seeps into your bones. A silence that doesn't shout but weighs. And though my body returned intact, untouched by shrapnel or bullet, something deeper inside me had cracked beyond repair, and in the years that followed, I learned to walk quietly through life, to carry that fracture with me like a second skin no one could see. I settled on the West Coast, Tacoma, Washington, near the Sound, where the fog drifts low in the mornings and the sea air feels older than memory. I took a job at the docks because the rhythm of lifting and stacking, of tide and labor, mirrored something I'd lost in the war, and for a while I convinced myself that work was enough, that moving boxes was easier than moving on. People didn't ask questions at the port, and I didn't offer answers. They saw an ex-serviceman with calloused hands and tired eyes, and let me be, which, in truth, was all I wanted. I never talked about the war, not even when other men, veterans like me, would bring up stories over a bottle or a cigarette. I just listened, nodded, maybe offered a word or two, but I kept my own stories buried deep because it didn't feel like mine to share. It felt like something that belonged to the fire and the dead, to names I couldn't remember and faces that still visited me in dreams I never asked for. The woman in the flames, the nurse, she came back to me often, not in visions, not as a ghost, but in the quiet moments. When I'd stand at the sink washing a single plate, or when the wind would carry smoke from a neighbor's chimney and my lungs would freeze, uninvited, she was always there. Not with words, just a presence, a weight on my chest. And I never told anyone because I wasn't sure she was real, wasn't sure I hadn't imagined her as some kind of mercy, a face to soften the horror, a voice to give the fire, a purpose. I married once. Her name was Eleanor, a schoolteacher with kind eyes and a voice that never rose in anger. She didn't ask about the war, didn't push, and I mistook that silence for peace. We shared 10 years together, a small apartment, weekend walks, quiet dinners, and then one February she caught pneumonia, and within days she was gone. No long goodbye, no last words, just a space in the bed and the sound of the radiator that would never quite shut off after that. After Eleanor, the silence returned, not as pain this time, but as routine. I woke, I worked, I read, I walked the same streets, and I began writing letters to no one, not out of madness, but out of need, like prayers sent into the void, addressed to no name, stamped with no return address. I wrote about her, the nurse, the fire, the moment, not as a confession, but as a way of keeping it real, of reminding myself that once, even just once, I had done something that mattered. Sometimes I'd sit in the park and imagine her life. Did she survive? Did she go back to her family? Did she become a nurse again? Or did she forget me as I was supposed to forget her? And in those moments, I'd tell myself that it didn't matter, that saving someone isn't about being remembered, it's about the act itself. But deep down, I think I wanted to know, not for validation, not for pride, but for peace. The years rolled on, and I aged the way old soldiers do, quietly, politely, out of the way. I visited cemeteries where I didn't know the names on the stones, lit candles for the unknown, sat on benches with only pigeons and wind for company, and still, in all that time, I never once thought that anyone, anywhere, still remembered me or what I had done. And then came 1989, the day I saw that hospital ship pulling into port. The day I told myself I was only going down to the water to take a look. The day I stood before a ship I had no business boarding and heard a voice from the past say, "He saved my life." And in that moment, the silence cracked. She led me through the corridors of the ship as if she already knew I belonged there, not with credentials or rank, not by name or uniform, but by something deeper, something older, a moment shared in smoke and fire, one neither of us had spoken of in decades, yet somehow had never truly left either of us. The metal floors hummed beneath our feet, polished and spotless, and the smell of antiseptic in the air was sharp, clinical. The same, I thought, as it must have been then during the war, when the scent of sterilization fought a losing battle against blood and burnt canvas. And yet here it was again, familiar, unchanged, as if the space itself had remembered. We passed through a narrow door into a quiet medical room, not large, but sterile and neat, with a small desk, 2 chairs, a supply cabinet, and the kind of light that felt like it belonged more to memory than to the present. Soft, filtered through a porthole, gently laying over her features as she sat across from me and took a long breath before she spoke. "I never knew your name," she said, and her voice was steady, but beneath the calm there was something else. Not tremor, but reverence, like someone stepping into a sacred space. "But I never forgot your face. For years, I thought I had imagined you, that maybe I dreamed you up in the chaos, but you were real. You were the only thing that was real that day." Her name, Lydia, she told me then for the first time, and though I'd gone more than 4 decades not knowing it, the sound of it seemed to echo with strange familiarity, as if I'd been waiting all these years just to hear it spoken aloud. She had survived the fire, had been evacuated to the east, sent through a series of camps and hospitals until she was eventually recruited into the Soviet Medical Corps, studied in Moscow, rose through the ranks, and spent her life leading medical teams for the Navy, always with a quiet focus, never speaking of the war unless necessary. And yet through it all, she told me she had carried two things with her, always. A silver medal she received days after the bombing, awarded for courage under fire, though she insisted she had done nothing but survive, and a charred piece of cloth, barely larger than a dollar bill, wrapped in plastic and kept in the inner pocket of her uniform. She placed it gently in my hand, and I recognized it instantly. It was the burnt corner of the surgical towel I had used to cover her mouth, to shield her from the smoke as I dragged her through fire. I had torn it in half without thinking, and somehow, impossibly, she had kept it all this time. And in that moment, the room blurred, the ship vanished, and I was back in the fire with her. Only this time, we had both made it through. She reached into her breast pocket, retrieved the medal, and turned it over. On the back, scratched into the metal by hand, were 2 digits. 45, the year of our meeting, the year of our separation, the year everything burned. They gave me this because I lived, she said, placing it beside the cloth. But I only lived because you came back for me. This medal was never really mine. And then, with a quiet finality that broke something open in me, she slid it across the table to me. "It's yours," she said. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat burned like it did that day in the tent, not from smoke this time, but from something much heavier. The weight of being seen, of being remembered, of being told that something you did once, something that felt like nothing, a single impulsive act in a storm of violence, had stayed with someone else long enough to bring them here, back to you. We sat there, not needing to explain anything further, because some truths live in silence more honestly than in speech. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't felt in years, that I wasn't just a man who survived a war. I was someone who had once saved a life, and that life had found its way back to me, across decades, through borders, across oceans, not to settle a debt, but to return a piece of myself I didn't know was still missing. After our quiet reunion in the medical bay, Lydia stood composed and steady as ever and asked me, gently but with a certain quiet insistence, if I would come back with her to the main deck. I hesitated for a moment, as I always did when the past reached too far into the present, but something in her voice, not urgency, not command, but something like reverence, told me this wasn't a simple walk through corridors. This was something else, something sacred. As we stepped out into the hallway, the sounds of the ship returned. Boots on steel, the low hum of distant engines, the soft murmur of voices, but they seemed to recede as we approached the upper deck, where the light was fading into that golden hour glow that makes even metal seem warm. Crew members lined the railings, some still in uniform, others resting with mugs of tea or clipboards in hand. And as we emerged, the murmur stilled slowly, like the hush that falls in a church when something holy is about to happen, even if no one quite knows why. Lydia walked ahead of me, upright, hair still neatly pinned beneath her cap, and turned to face the gathering, just a handful of people, but enough to make my pulse quicken. I didn't like being looked at, never had, especially not after the war. The idea of being seen had always felt dangerous, exposing. But this was different, because Lydia wasn't just looking at me, she was presenting me, and with a voice clear but soft, she said, This man is the reason I am standing here." No fanfare followed, no applause, just silence, the respectful kind, the kind that listens. The ship's captain, a tall, composed man in a pressed navy coat, stepped forward. He didn't shake my hand right away, didn't rush the moment. Instead, he looked at me as though searching for something he already knew was there, then said, "We don't have your name in our records. We don't have your service files or your commendations. But we do have a story, and that to us is enough." And from the inner pocket of his coat, he drew out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a replica of the medal Lydia had carried all these years. He didn't pin it on me. He simply held it out. And when I took it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pride exactly, but something quieter, more rooted. I felt seen, not by a system or a nation, but by people, by witnesses, by someone who had remembered. I followed Lydia slowly along the deck, the medal now resting in my palm like a stone warmed by sunlight, and the breeze off the harbour carried a hush through the ship's hull, as if the vessel itself recognized that something had come full circle, that a man who had entered quietly, denied at first, now walked not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as someone finally brought home. We stopped at the railing, leaning into the open air, where seabirds flew in slow arcs above the water, and the reflection of the sky rippled like memory across the surface. Lydia stood beside me, not speaking for a long while, and then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I used to wonder if you'd made it, if you survived the rest of it. I always hoped you did, but I never imagined this." I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. There are some moments where words are too fragile to carry the weight. She smiled, small and tired, then reached into her coat once more, not for the medal, not for documents or papers, but for something simpler, an invitation scrawled in her handwriting to join her and the crew for supper in the ship's galley. "You've eaten alone long enough," she said. "Tonight you eat with us." It wasn't a gesture of pity. It wasn't even hospitality. It was inclusion. It was her saying, without fanfare, that I wasn't invisible anymore, not to her, not to them, not to the memory that brought us back together. That evening, over simple bowls of soup and quiet laughter among strangers who no longer felt strange, I realized something I had spent years forgetting, that the most extraordinary thing we can do, even in the face of war, is to remember one another. I stepped off the ship that evening, not as a soldier, not even as a guest, but as something I hadn't felt in decades. A man remembered. The wind had picked up along the harbour, and the last light of day filtered through the cranes and ship masts like golden threads woven through memory. And on my chest, tucked securely against my coat, the replica medal Lydia had given me felt heavier than its weight, because it carried more than metal. It carried a moment, a life, a bond that defied time. Back home, in the small apartment where I've spent the better part of my later years, quiet walls, a well-worn armchair, a shelf of old books and black and white photographs that mean little to anyone else. The medal rests now on my mantel, not in a case or behind glass, but out in the open where the light from the window touches it every morning. Beside it sits an envelope, Lydia's last letter, written in a hand that had grown slower, a little less steady, but still precise, still hers. She passed away a few years after that day on the ship. Peacefully, I was told, in her sleep, after a long career and a quiet retirement in a town near the coast. I didn't go to the funeral. There was no need, because what we had wasn't built for ceremonies or gravesites. It was built in a moment of fire, sealed in gratitude, and reaffirmed in the kind of reunion no one plans but everyone hopes for. Her letter said only this: "You gave me back my life. I hope I returned the favor." And I believe she did, not by saving me from death, but by saving me from vanishing, from becoming one of those silent veterans who disappear quietly into routine and shadows, who are remembered only by the dog tags in a drawer or a photograph no one recognizes anymore. She gave me a name again, not just mine, but the name of what I had done and who I had been. There was never romance between us, not in the way stories are usually told, but what we shared was a kind of love far deeper, the love of survival, the love of gratitude, the love of knowing that for a brief, searing moment in the middle of horror, two strangers found each other and did not look away. And that more than any medal, more than any inscription on any wall, is the thing I hold on to. That once, long ago, in the middle of a war, I made a choice, and someone remembered. And maybe that's all we can ever hope for. Not glory, not fame, not even justice. Just to be remembered by one person whose life touched yours in a way neither of you could ever forget. We share new, true stories every day. Moments of love, war, memory, and grace. If this one spoke to you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these voices alive.